If Marvel's Avengers was made by an in-house Marvel team, I really wouldn't care about how bad it is. I'd simply move on. But the only thing worse than a scummy game like this is a scummy game that kills off a great series in the process. That series is Deus Ex. Thanks so much for that, Square Enix, by the way. So let's jump in and have a look. Hi, Stelden here. I'm someone who's not a big fan of the big publishers out there. EA, Activision, I think they've done a lot to hurt gaming in the last decade, and they seem to be really doubling down on their shady tactics as we head into the next generation of games. Square Enix, though, I think they're a company that doesn't seem to get the same level of attention or scrutiny. You never really hear them in sentences where people are talking about the most predatory tactics the industry has to offer. And why is that? It's probably because they weren't always that bad, and it can take some time for a bad reputation to really fester. It's not like Bethesda where you can release Fallout 76, which is very much like taking a big shit on people's doorsteps. It's super obvious, no one likes it, and people just hate you overnight. Square Enix's decline is far more along the lines of someone urinating on everyone's favourite hedge every day. You don't notice it immediately, but over time, that hedge actually shrivels up and dies, and that's what is going on at Square Enix. They've killed a bunch of series over the years. Deus Ex, for me, is a real big one, but they've also managed to ruin Thief, possibly the best stealth series ever, and they even got rid of the Hitman devs, which very nearly bankrupted them. This to me is very reminiscent of EA in the early 2000s, where they brought series like Command & Conquer and then basically left them to go extinct only a few years later. Like EA, they try and twist series into being what they want, what's convenient and they think will sell. And when they don't, they leave them to die and they blame the IPs, not their own idiotic ideas. I want to give some real context here though. Deus Ex Human Revolution, it was a big success. Many die-hard fans of the series, so people who love the original PC game were actually very skeptical of what a Square Enix-driven Deus Ex game might look like. The studio making it, Eidos Montreal, they'd never made a game before, and suddenly, they had them in the driver's seat of this sacred IP. The result was actually pretty damn good. Even real old-school types who hate most modern games have generally found something to love with this game, and it seemed like they were really just heading down a positive road. Then Thief 2014 happened, and Jesus Christ, we just couldn't get lucky twice apparently. That seemed to be the message. They got it right with Deus Ex, but then completely fucked it up with Thief. That's where the red flags really started, because with Thief, they made it clear that they didn't want anyone to think that you actually had to be a thief, play really stealthy to enjoy it, which is really just ludicrous, because I mean, a toddler could look at the series and say, oh, so it's called Thief, I guess you play as a thief. Apparently not, according to Square, since it's painfully obvious that they meddle with the game to try and make it more appealing to a broader audience, not just stealth fans. Their meddling continued with the sequel to Human Revolution, which was Mankind Divided. For many, the actual content was pretty much on par with the previous game, but it was clear they were trying to set this up as some sort of trilogy, meaning content seemed cut, was less meaty, and it appeared to be rushed out as basically sequel bait. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact is that sequel is likely never coming because Square Enix decided to cut their losses due to ridiculous sales expectations. They got into bed with Marvel and now they're producing what we now know is utter garbage. Marvel's Avengers. We have 2 studios working on this game. 2 studios that could have been making the next Deus Ex, the next Tomb Raider. Instead, they're making some cookie-cutter looter shooter title that's designed to lure people in who've got no real interest in video games. They just want to play as Iron Man, they want to play as Thor. That's the sad state of Square Enix and publishers just like them. They see video game fans as a nuisance. They want clued-in people to be silenced because they can see through the bullshit. They see through the curtain. If you're running Square Enix, who do you want as a customer? Little Johnny, who binged all the Avengers movies last weekend, Mummy's gone out and bought him a PS4, now he gets to play as his favourite hero? Is Little Johnny someone who questions microtransactions, finds it odd that DLC is being shoved into chip packets and soft drink instead of just being included in the actual game? No, he just wants to play as Captain America. Game publishers love these sort of customers. They're not the sort of people who are going to start an online revolution, like we saw with Star Wars Battlefront, and then force the devs to make changes. They feel like something is magical just because they can play as their favourite hero. They aren't going to question mechanics, monetization, the nuts and bolts of what's going into the actual game and the gameplay. Basically, Marvel's Avengers is created and designed for the uninformed consumer. Non-video gamers, essentially. Sure, I mean, plenty of actual gamers will play it, but even if they kick up a stink, Square Enix won't care as long as that real casual audience is spending in-game and they're getting a big return on the investment. And I can pretty much tell you now, with how ridiculous sales expectations are with them sometimes, this really needs to sell if they're going to get their money's worth, because it's a bit like Kingdom Hearts. They don't own all the properties, so they're likely sharing a big chunk of those profits with someone else. The difference here though is series like Deus Ex I would consider to be more hardcore. They are far from mainstream. They're games developed by gamers for gamers. You're going to see more passionate, vocal fans when you stuff something up in a series like that compared to Marvel's Avengers, and Square know it. And you know what, I'm just going to refer to Square Enix as Square now because I really cannot be fucked saying the Enix part. I mean, it's just two company names combined. It doesn't really flow, let's be honest. What's really interesting to me and gives a lot of credibility to Square's meddling in the Deus Ex studio is actually an article a few years ago about Eidos Montreal's founder resigning. Now, I'm going to take a bit of a punt saying his name, but in the article, founder Steven Diastos explained that due to a poor sales year, Square wanted to make a whole bunch of changes, and so he couldn't do his job effectively. They were no longer being allowed to simply make games with creative freedom. But hang on just a minute, because it sounds like Square were blaming the studio and their output for why the games weren't selling well. But let's actually take a look back. Their first game, Human Revolution, appears to have been made with mostly full creative freedom being allowed. It generally felt like an old school immersive sim. It wasn't dumbed down, it had a lot of awesome elements, great new features. Then Square got more involved. Thief 2014 was a failure due to not sticking to the series' strengths and trying to make it into a you can be anything you want sort of game, master of none, and lo and behold, you're having a sales problem. There is zero accountability from management with these sorts of things. The publisher fucks it up and it's always the studio who takes the blame. They're the ones given the flick. It's clear that Steven Diastos wasn't willing to be a yes man and he was sent out the door. For all we know, he was pushed out. No coincidence, a year later, they're balls deep in the development of Avengers. They've been stripped of all creative control, and they're working with another talented studio, Crystal Dynamics, to create a game that has clearly just been developed with spreadsheets, graphs, other nonsense in mind, rather than just creative talent dictating what might make a good game. My opinion on Marvel's Avengers is not necessarily that it's like the worst game of all time, it's more that these sorts of games are just pretty much always shit and cookie cutter. When you design a game to be a service for the sole purpose of ensuring you can keep people spending money over time, the game is always going to just suffer creatively. It's why these games always seem to die out after a few years. They've been created to get as much money as possible out of people in a short space of time, and then they want to rinse and repeat that cycle. They'll start out with the hype, the extravagant cinematic trailers. They can't get away with that in a genuine 10 plus year long live service, because then even the dumbest of people will get fed up by that point and realize that the devs, or the publisher in this case, are telling lies. All of this makes me think back to classic World of Warcraft and all those MMOs back in the day. World of Warcraft, for example, it wasn't conceived to be this big juggernaut that was going to take over gaming. It was a live service, but it was designed with the right intentions. It might have had 100,000 players, or that's what the devs thought. It might do some really cool things. But it was designed as a game first and for the gameplay experience. Now we get the live service, all these console-focused ones, they're not about that. They've been conceived to be a live service, not because the developers or the creative team think that's what's going to make a great game. It's because the publishers simply think that's what's going to make money. So that is the real key difference. Unfortunately, games like Marvel's Avengers are always going to be around because selling to the lowest common denominator, it's pretty much any business's dream. You get clueless people buying your product, they don't do any research, they buy with their gut, and they're never pesky, they never ask any questions about things like a design loop based around you spending money. The problem really for me is when you're doing all that, but there's no alternative, there's no games for gamers designed for that hardcore audience. I can tell you right now that gaming won't always be mainstream. I certainly don't know whether or not it has peaked. For all we know, I mean, one day we might get a VR where we literally walk around a world. We have conversations with people and we can do just about anything we want. That could happen. But there's also the chance that something such as that will just never be profitable, and this will pretty much be it. You look at the music industry. In the 70s and 80s, music was huge. It was a massive part of the mainstream. There was MTV, arena concerts were everywhere you looked. And now it's still there, but it certainly isn't as big as it once was. It's very much background noise for a lot of people. Gaming could very well be in the same boat. This might be the big peak, and in 20 years' time, the bulk of people will move on to something else, and it will just be us nerdy people left. If that happens, what are these publishers going to do? They'll no longer be able to design games around monetization. We've seen all the tricks. For us, Assassin's Creed, Final Fantasy 15, games like that, they're kind of like a magician performing magic tricks for other magicians. We've seen all of this before. Chasing markers around the minimap, addicting gameplay loops that give you a dopamine hit, but have no actual depth to them. All of that works on a new, naive audience, but they don't work on seasoned gamers who want games like the original Deus Ex, Human Revolution. And if you kill off all those series, if you want to promote your fast food style Marvel's Avengers games, you will not have a devoted audience left once the fad wears off. There's two scenarios Square could be looking at here, and I'm gonna start with the bad one so we can at least end on a good note to some degree. If Marvel's Avengers is a dynamic success, despite the poor reception, and I've got to say, these studios have really fucked up with these live services. I mean, Fallout 76, Anthem, Avengers, when you can't even get the mainstream games media praising you rubbish, you really know you've screwed up. It used to be your bread and butter to have them frothing at the bit over the latest generic Call of Duty, but it never caught on with those other sorts of games. Maybe it's because if you release one live service every 6 years instead of 3 games every 2, there's less games for them to review, less work for them. Maybe that's it. Anyway, the bad scenario is Avengers sells well despite the bad reception, bad word of mouth, but enough fans eat it all up and Square laugh to the bank. If that happens, I would not be surprised if Crystal Dynamics and Eidos are just live service hamster wheels for the next few years. Probably updating this game while also making a sequel that they can then push to next gen in a few years' time, and say they need a brand new $60 release. Actually, I mean, it's $70 with the price increase, I've got to get used to saying that, but that will be their path for the next few years. The other scenario, and to me this is the more ideal scenario obviously, is this game is a flop. When I say flop, I don't mean it'll sell no copies, because obviously that's not going to happen. I'm trying to be realistic. Flop here, though, could just mean underperforming a little. Remember that Square aren't just keeping all the money from this game, this is a Marvel property. And it's likely less profitable for Square compared to an IP of their own that brings in the same revenue. Keeping this in mind, this game probably needs to be an absolute smash hit for Square to keep up with it and continue down the road. The bad reception might just have been enough to put people off playing it. The horrible reception of Anthem, similar titles like that, might have done enough to make gamers think twice and realise that if they just wait it out, the game will be in the bargain bin sometime next week. Or they can even wait until next year when it goes free to play, like we've seen with Destiny, and people can save their hard-earned cash. If that happens, we could see Square have some self-awareness for once and realise they made a big mistake. Deus Ex Mankind Divided may not have been a big success, but they might come to a realisation that trying to force trilogy plans, trying to really just force all that down everyone's throats, maybe that affected sales, and the bad word of mouth that came for it might have been the real cause. They might realise, just maybe, that if you create an excellent immersive sim, let the devs go wild, let them be creative, that it may actually bring customers to the table. And apparently this must be a ridiculous thought, but maybe when you design a thief game, you actually focus on players being a thief, designing the mechanics around that. Square Enix have simply been a shit show of a publisher for a long time. They've been way too focused on short-term gains, not really thinking about the future, which is gonna matter, because if this game is a juggernaut and it does really well for Marvel, they eventually might turn around and say, well, we don't really need Square, we can develop our own team, we can make games in-house, and then we can just cut out the middleman, essentially, being Square, and they can do their own thing. Then what is Square going to do? Because they don't have Hitman, they don't really have Deus Ex now, they're going to have to start again. So Square, think about it. Think about the long term. Think about actually building fans. The IPs you've got sitting there that are now your own, you've bought them or you've taken them over. Do something with them. Don't let them sit idly by and die away. We want another Deus Ex. Hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please comment, like, and subscribe. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks very much, and bye-bye.